Welcome to Southbound, Retire in South Africa, a guide and companion for anyone looking to call this vibrant nation home. I'm Jeremy Maggs, here to help you navigate through the intricacies of a new life in South Africa. This series, brought to you by Xpatweb, aims to provide invaluable insights and advice for a smooth transition and a successful life here on the southern tip of Africa. In each episode, we'll delve into various aspects of South African life, everything from moving money to immigration and property investment. So whether you're considering a move, already in the process, or just curious, you are in the right place. Stay tuned as we embark on this journey together, uncovering all that South Africa has to offer. In this episode, we'll look at the ins and outs of choosing and acquiring property in South Africa. Dr. Andrew Golding is one of the leading experts in the country's property sector, serving as chief executive of the Pam Golding Property Group. It's a company that was started by his mother and property icon Pam Golding in the 1970s. Almost 25 years later, the company has over 300 offices in Southern Africa and internationally. So, Andrew Golding, a very warm welcome to the program. First of all, let's start with this. What makes South Africa's real estate market unique for foreign investors? And I'm going to imagine that the word value is going to come in somewhere.
I think value is probably the word that springs to mind first, but I think there are lots of other features, in particular the climate, the appeal in terms of diversity, both of what the country has to offer, but also in terms of diversity of property itself. So there are many different markets that I think foreigners find attractive in South Africa, and many, many reasons why foreigners do in fact buy property in South Africa.
And Andrew, one of those is that you can outright own the property, can't you?
Correct. In terms of worldwide trends, we are probably a slight exception in that regard, in that the ability to buy property as a foreigner is relatively unrestricted compared to many other parts of the world.
For the benefit of someone who's thinking of coming to South Africa, settling and retiring, just give us a sense, if you can, in the broadest possible terms, to how the South African property market has evolved over the past couple of years.
So I think like many property markets around the world, in fact, probably all of them, they were affected by the COVID pandemic. Many of the trends and influences that we now see are synonymous with trends in most parts of particularly the Western world. But I think in terms of the way the market has evolved, it's a very vibrant market. It's one which is governed by willing buyer, willing seller principles, and where the ability to transact and have security of tenure in terms of a single deeds office registration process gives foreigners a sense of comfort around not being concerned that the property purchase that they go through is going to have any kind of difficulties in terms of the statutory process of owning that property.
Let's reflect on some of those trends in just a moment, but I'm also thinking that one of the other unique selling points must be the whole concept of space.
Yeah, there's no question that in terms of value and space, we generally work on a principle of roughly 10 times. In other words, what you would pay for an equivalent property in London, New York, Paris, Western Europe, or pretty much most parts of the globe, in terms of a comparative value, you're going to pay 10 times less in South Africa for something that is equivalent. Or put another way, in terms of comparing what you have in your metropolitan area of Berlin or Amsterdam, and you look at the difference in what you're going to be able to purchase in South Africa, the relative concept of space is quite significant. The sense of value for money is probably the thing that drives most purchasers who come to South Africa, often initially as tourists, but then come and visit again and again and take an interest in the property market and then ultimately decide to buy because they do see incredible value, they see wonderful lifestyle, and obviously climate and cost of living is also another feature.
And they eventually become Springbok rugby supporters.
And they eventually inevitably become Springbok rugby supporters.
Inevitably is the right word. What are some of those post-COVID contemporary trends that you were referring to?
Firstly, just governed by the hybrid work environment or the work from home environment is the ability now through technology to be able to live, work and play pretty much anywhere. And so lifestyle considerations have taken significant preference over things like worrying about commuting times and public transport issues. So small town South Africa has really boomed, in particular the coastal parts of small town South Africa. So that's both the west and the east coast have really benefited from not only low local residents deciding that that's where they want to live, but also foreigners choosing to relocate their businesses or to retire to places that they find attractive. And that could be metropolitan South Africa, but in many instances, in terms of real value for money, small town South Africa has certainly benefited significantly from that. And so many areas which were predominantly holiday destinations or holiday towns and villages have become much more dominated by permanent residents, and those permanent residents are either local or foreign.
So we'd be talking about places, for instance, like Knysna.
Correct. Pretty much all the way up the Garden Route, starting really from Hermanus and even before that in terms of geography, Gordons Bay, Betty's Bay, etc., but all the way up through the traditional Garden Route areas of Mossel Bay, George, Knysna and Plettenberg Bay. Those towns have really enjoyed a significant post-COVID boom, even going up as far as the Eastern Cape, where towns like St. Francis and St. Francis Bay, Kenton and Port Alfred have had significant uplifts in number of transactions that have taken place and significant house price growth as a consequence of demand exceeding supply or just simply people looking to invest. And obviously all of this is against a trend which has been very significant in South Africa. It's not a foreign trend, but a local one of semigration, where there has been a trend of people moving from the north of the country to the south, or certainly from the inland parts of the country to the coastal parts.
Andrew, are there specific legal frameworks which people should be aware of that are in place for foreign nationals looking to invest in real estate in this country?
There are very clear and distinct legal considerations which one needs to take into account. As I mentioned earlier, there is a single deeds office registry process which gives comfort in terms of the ownership, the legal ownership of the property. And then there is a process which has its own nuances in terms of the South African buying and selling process, which consists of a willing buyer, willing seller transaction and agreement. And then once that agreement is signed by both sets of parties, the property then needs to be taken via a conveyancing process through the deeds office, the central deeds office. And once that registration takes place, then the property ownership transfers from the seller to the buyer.
Which would then beg the follow-up question, what type of financing options are available to foreign nationals then who want to go ahead and make the purchase?
So there are many financing options available. They are diverse and they consist of local financing options through local South African banks, and that is dependent on the individual's balance sheet and their ability to meet credit criteria in terms of the local banking structures. Generally speaking, that can be up to 50% of the purchase price. But there are also opportunities for international bank-to-bank transactions where, depending again on the infrastructure and balance sheet of the purchaser, there may be an opportunity, for example, for 100% of the purchase price to be organized through different mortgage options, both locally and internationally.
And just flesh out for us again the tax implications for investment.
The tax implications are predominantly on exit, and that is a capital gains tax consideration, which effectively looks at the gain after expenses, appropriate expenses have been deducted on the difference between the purchase price and ultimately the selling price. And then depending on various circumstances, there is a capital gains tax levied, which is anything from 15 to roughly 25% of the gain that needs to be paid as call it an exit tax from the property. There are options around structuring in terms of buying the property, not necessarily in one's own name, through either trusts or companies. And generally speaking, it would be advisable for any foreigner to look at all the structuring options because they all are nuanced and have different advantages depending on each individual's personal circumstances.
Are there specific government regulations that purchasers should be aware of before they take the step?
Probably the first one and most important one is about residency and the ability to reside in the country and as a consequence of purchasing a property in the property that they have bought. And that talks to the residence permit application process and the need to make sure that that application and that process is well underway in advance of purchasing the property, because there can be delays in terms of that granting of that residence permit. If the purchaser is just going to be in the country for a short period of time and effectively using the property only for leisure, then that residence permit is often not needed.
Andrew, as attractive as you make the South African property purchase option, obviously this country is competing with other countries. If you were to rate ease of purchase against others in our competitive set, how would you rank us?
All things considered, provided that the purchaser does their homework upfront and gets a good understanding of potentially the differences between buying a property in their own home country and South Africa, the ease of purchase is actually very smooth. There have been hundreds of transactions to foreigners every year. And so there is a well-oiled process which can be expedited reasonably quickly. There's no delay necessarily in the transfer process comparing a foreign transaction to a local one. We generally work on a principle of around about 90 to 120 days, being the period of time from the date of signature of an agreement to purchase to the time that the property can become the purchaser's. So that is a relatively short space of time. And comparing that to the competitor set, which is very varied around the world, that compares favorably.
Obviously, you've got to do your homework, and it would be incumbent upon any purchaser to watch currency fluctuation.
Probably the biggest consideration for foreigners is the fact that, on the one hand, in coming into the country, they look at the value for money proposition and it's extremely favorable. But at the same time, they have to consider that if they are looking to exit, the rand foreign currency exchange rate may be in their favor or it may not be in their favor. At the same time, they need to balance that with the particular circumstances around house price growth in South Africa, the economic climate. In many instances, we would advise foreigners to go into that transaction with their eyes open around understanding the potential fluctuations in currency, which have certainly been prominent over the last couple of years, but at the same time, equally significant fluctuations, both positive and negative, in house price growth. And so the timing, I think, like with any property market, the timing to get both coming into the market and then exiting the market is an extremely difficult one to get absolutely right.
Which segues nicely into the next question. Apart from watching currency, you've got to be well aware of broader economic conditions, whether it's in South Africa or any other country. But in this country particularly, how do those conditions generally affect the real estate market?
They affect the real estate market significantly. So we are unquestionably very influenced by predominantly interest rates in this country. It's probably the single biggest factor that determines what kind of cycle the local real estate market is in. And so at the moment, we are in a market that's characterized by interest rates having risen quite considerably. And as expected, that has caused a slowdown in the number of transactions that take place in the country and house price growth. And so that is the current scenario. We are hopeful that we're at the top end of that interest rate cycle and that we'll begin to see, probably in the first quarter of next year or maybe the second quarter of next year, the start of a decrease in interest rates, which usually signals the start of another surge in activity in terms of the property market. We are, of course, influenced by global events. So there's no question that whatever's happening globally ultimately affects us as well. And so foreigners are advised to be informed on both instances and take a view on what those conditions, both local and international, are going to have on their property purchase.
And Andrew Golding, it would be irresponsible of us not to talk about safety and security in South Africa, and people would have concerns. How would that impact real estate investment decision in South Africa? What risks are you looking at and how do you mitigate against them?
I think it falls into the category of ensuring that when you are considering a property purchase in South Africa, that you take the time and trouble to be as informed as possible. And that does require some significant due diligence. I think it's important to do that due diligence personally. And safety and security is no question an important consideration, which every single purchaser, both local and foreign, needs to take into account. But it falls into the category for me of doing a significant and complete due diligence so that you do make an informed purchase. And part of that is safety and security considerations.
What advice would you give in terms of doing that due diligence? What's the process?
There's an opportunity to do a lot in these days with technology of desktop research, and there are some very good articles, some very comprehensive pieces of information which give a very good and broad overview of purchasing property in South Africa. And then there is the need to come and see and taste and touch what you think you might be interested in. I think it's important to engage with the local property industry, presumably and hopefully with a reputable company to ensure that you get the best possible advice. I think that one truism of, in particular, residential property is that it is very hyper-local. And so one can think that one is purchasing in a suburb and generalize about that particular suburb, but it is much more nuanced than that. And you really need to be able to get up-to-date local advice about a particular property that you're interested in, to make sure that whatever you may have thought you are seeing on desktop or some kind of digital research is in fact what you're getting, and that you find a local trusted property advisor to essentially hold your hand and walk you through the process. Because even for a local, it's an extremely complex and nuanced process with many, many steps along the way. And so, our advice would be to make sure that you find an advisor and get them to help you through the process step by step, which can take anything from 6 months to a year in terms of doing your homework and finding the right property and then ultimately purchasing it.
I'm really pleased you used that phrase taste and touch, because it's also important to understand local culture and practice, isn't it?
Very much so. If you're going to go to the trouble of purchasing a property in South Africa, there's no question that an understanding of local customs and norms is absolutely imperative. And again, that forms part of this comprehensive tick box list of considerations to make sure that you are as well informed as possible, and that this isn't just a situation of coming in cold and being uninformed and then being surprised.
Andrew, what types of properties, residential, commercial, industrial, are you seeing as the most appealing to foreign property investors in South Africa? And also just give us a sense in terms of the rental market.
So I think it is very much a case of horses for courses, and it really depends on the individual investor's appetite for which particular kind of property they are looking for. So it really does vary. There's an appetite for industrial property, there's an appetite for commercial property, and of course, an appetite for residential, which itself is made up of so many different genres and different types, which needs to take areas and geography into account. So there is a huge bouquet of opportunities, and the purchaser needs to tailor those to their specific needs and requirements. So if it's simply about achieving a capital growth return and almost as a passive investment, then it might be an industrial property. If it's a property that the purchaser potentially wants to use for some part of the year for leisure, then that has a whole different consideration. There is a range of different buying needs in terms of retirement, other investment considerations around perhaps schooling for children, and all sorts of other considerations, which all need to be taken into account when one starts the process of thinking about buying a property in a foreign country. From a rental market perspective, the rental market has also been very buoyant in the post-COVID environment. The market was characterized by a significant shortage of rental stock, and rising rental returns. In terms of the buy-to-let market, the buy-to-let investor market at the moment, it has also been affected by the rising interest rates. And so that always puts a bit of a squeeze on the rental returns. And right now, the borrowing rate is sitting at around about north of 10%, and the rental return is probably sitting at an average of 6%. That's before you've taken costs into account. So somewhere between 4 and 5% is what you'd be looking to get in terms of a net rental return as a generalization across the country. And again, it's not always a good idea to generalize, because there are many examples where rental returns are significantly higher than that. But if one wants to get just a general sense of the rental market, there are a number of opportunities in terms of buy-to-let properties. But again, one needs to go into that with an understanding of where that sits relative to your borrowing costs, if that's what you're going to be doing.
At some point, you might want to get out of the market. Is there any particular advice that you'd give in that respect in terms of exit strategy?
It's probably wise for the homeowner in this case to do their homework, to get a very good sense of what is happening specifically and particularly in that market at the time that they're looking to sell. Obviously, to contact a reputable agent or agents to get a sense of comparative market evaluation, and then to think about specifically looking for advice around the time to take the property to market, the way to market that property, and to ensure that the pricing is adequate and correct. And probably the biggest mistake that both local and foreign sellers are making is to try and aim too high, put the property on the market. It doesn't sell because the price is in fact out of kilter with where the market is. And then the property becomes tainted because it's been on the market, it's been exposed, and anyone surveying the market assumes that there is a challenge with this particular property, and properties that are on the market are competing with each other. And so it's important to just make sure that you optimize the selling opportunity when you decide to sell.
Andrew Golding, I'm sure you ask this question all the time, but if you were to give us a prediction of the South African real estate market over the next, 2 to 5 years, are you able to look ahead?
Post-COVID, it's almost impossible to look very far into the future, but we always try and give a bit of a sense of the next 12 months. We are coming out of a rising interest rate cycle. Interest rates are probably at the top of the cycle. Hopefully, we'll look to find interest rates coming down. That will undoubtedly give a boost to the property market. And in conjunction with the improving electricity situation, there is a sense of optimism that if both of those things happen, then not only will GDP start to get going and the economy will start to improve, but off the back of hopefully lowering interest rates and inflation under control, that we could be in for an optimistic view of the property market. That's both in terms of number of sales and also in terms of house price growth.
Andrew Golding, thank you very much indeed.